I get the honor of a formal introduction of Mark Yarhouse. I am not going to read his bio. It's in your program on page 25 if you want a more thorough review of his scholarship and his work and his credentials. I'm just going to introduce Mark. Mark has been, Dr. Yarhouse, I should say, maybe I'm too personal. Dr. Yarhouse has been on our short list of people that we have kind of dreamed of having here at the North Star Conference from the beginning. And he has been extremely gracious in coming to be with us today. Real briefly, I want to say, you can read all the accolades. Dr. Yarhouse, I hope this doesn't feel too... I really admire him a great deal. Elder Maxwell described what he called the disciple scholar, and that for the disciple of Jesus Christ, academic research is a form of worship, or can be a form of worship. And we have many people in the LDS community who do that, who kind of bring together this seeking knowledge by study and by faith. And Mark, Dr. Yarhouse, Mark, is it okay if I call you Mark? Thank you. Is one of those people that for years and years and years, he has been as a sincere and serious disciple of Jesus Christ, and a sincere and serious student of research and learning from people and clinical practice. He runs directs what's called the Institute for the Study of Sexual Identity at Regent University in Virginia. And in the last few years has done quite a bit of work also on gender identity. He spoke on both of those in breakout workshops today. We're very, very grateful to have him, and we're grateful to have him here sharing some general knowledge with all of us, just from his vast experience over the last several years as a guest disciple scholar and a guest brother in Jesus Christ. Mark Yarhouse.
Thanks, Ty. I think by the fourth time you call me Mark, I think we just got to say, yeah, let's just go there. That's fine. I don't think much of, titles are not really what matters. So I know you have a great heart, and it is a pleasure to be with you. It's been on my calendar for a while to come. Even before we had finalized me coming here, it was on my calendar that I would have an opportunity to speak to you, and it's a treat to do that. As Ty mentioned, let me see here. I'm not sure where I aimed this, but by the way, the screen up here is not showing it. I don't know if that's something that we can facilitate, but I do direct this institute. My web information is available to you if you want to track what we're doing. We do original research on the experiences of people navigating either sexual or gender identity and their religious identity, principally as Christians, just what the challenges that they would face. And it's interesting. I try to pattern the research we do off of what's done in the mainstream of psychology in this area, and then look at sort of Christian variables, like what would a Christian community be asking of the same, the same experience? Like what would matter to a faith community, or what am I seeing when I meet with people and the questions that they're asking, like questions of theodicy, of where is God in suffering, and it's a treat to work with. I usually work with about 14 to 16 doctoral students who are doing original research there, and it's been a pleasure to do that. And so it's nice to be able to meet with you and kind of draw on that and think through these things together. I want to share one thing that's been helpful. I came across this idea of different lenses through which people see research on LGBT issues. I came across it when I was working on a book on transgender experiences, and I sent it to a friend of mine who's gay and in a mixed orientation marriage, and he said, he's British. He was like, brilliant, and then, which actually doesn't mean it's brilliant. It's just, you're just being nice and saying this is good. I used to think we were really saying something here about my intelligence, but we really weren't ever. But anyway, brilliant. And then he was saying that this has really been helpful as a lens to think through his experiences too. And so I just wanted to share it to you to sort of go back 30,000 feet. Let's pull back and say, when people approach these topics, what are the lenses through which they see data, research, doctrine, scripture, the people navigating these issues, families? How is it that we're disagreeing so much in our culture today? And so the first lens is the lens of integrity. And this is a lens that I would say many people of faith draw on principally through Genesis 1 and 2 and the creation stories of that there is a male-female distinction intended by God at creation. And then the bringing together of those two is meant to kind of lay the foundation, the parameters for what's morally permissible in marriage. And then outside of that, the things that would be morally impermissible. And then it speaks into questions then about cross-gender identification and things like that. So I kind of give you a description here why same-sex behavior would be viewed as morally impermissible, and why some resolutions of gender dysphoria would be a concern. Now I know this is really poor form to quote yourself, but I'm going to quote a part of a book I wrote. I'm actually trying to quote the theologian whose view I'm representing here. And this person said, so from the integrity framework, same-sex sexual behavior is sin in part because it doesn't, here's the theologian, quote, merge or join two persons into an integrated sexual whole. The essential maleness and essential femaleness is not brought together as intended from creation. So now he extends this to transsexuality, and he says, the theological concern rests then in, quote, the denial of the integrity of one's own sex in an overt attempt at marring the image, a sacred image of maleness or femaleness formed by God. And so for many people, they would be drawn to this lens in our culture and in our faith communities today. It would sort of resonate with them as to why this is kind of why they hold certain views and why some topics are really tough for them to navigate. A second lens that I introduced was called disability, and I'm not quite sure this is the right word for it. I've gotten a little bit of email on that. I would say it's an experience that you empathize with rather than a moral concern you correct. And so an experience you empathize with would see these concerns, same-sex sexuality, gender dysphoria. These are variations that do occur in nature. And if you're a Christian drawn to this, you'd be reading more than from Genesis 3, and you would say, why do these variations occur in nature? Well, they occur in nature because nature's fallen. And because nature's fallen, things aren't the way they're supposed to be. And so some people see these as kind of non-moral realities we should approach with more compassion. Others would see that there's sin involved, but not so much moral culpability, more like, yeah, we live in a fallen world. And the fallen world we describe as sinful, but not that we hold this person as morally culpable for their attractions or for their gender identity concerns. So Pope Francis actually says something close to this. He says, things must be taken as they come, and tendencies or hormonal imbalances have many problems, and we must be careful not to say that everything is the same. Let's go party. No, this English is not his first language, so let me just say that. But in every case, I accept it, I accompany it, I study it, I discern it, and I integrate it. That's what Jesus would do today. It's a human problem, and it must be resolved. Always can be with the mercy of God, with the truth, but always with an open heart. There's not so much there about, he does in a full quote talk about sin, but not so much moral correction as we don't know what causes these experiences. We've got to walk with people. We've got to sort of journey with them as they figure this out. And it just has kind of a different quality than sometimes I bump up against when I talk with people. When I talk with people who are exclusively in the integrity framework, they tend to talk with me more about the willful disobedience of the person, the having the attractions, having the gender identity conflict is a moral concern to some of them, and it requires a kind of moral correction. When I run into people who are kind of in the disability lens, it's like, wow, that must be a really difficult thing to navigate. How do we live faithfully before God with that experience? Do you see the difference in sort of the quality of how the person's responding? And then the third group would be people who would sort of highlight same-sex sexuality and gender diverse presentations. These aren't moral concerns to them. They aren't issues of compassion and empathy. These are expressions of diversity that we would be celebrating. And so this is where the broader culture has rapidly moved towards. My field was there beforehand waiting for everybody. I mean, there's this sense of multiculturalism and diversity here that is very compelling to people. One person that I've engaged with at the APA, who's a theologian who transitioned and has changed his views on this, but here's what Adam would say about this. Adam says, trans people are not God's mistake, although other forms of human diversity may also wrongly lead to expressions by the privileged majority, differences of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, nationality, physical ability, orientation, religion. They often don't seem to cause the moral, theological outrage that gender diverse people do, as if their very existence blasphemes against God. Yet to be born outside the gender binary really isn't any different than being born with any other form of diversity. To explain to others that we are transgender doesn't inherently suggest God made any sort of mistake in creating us as transgender. So you can kind of get the sense that the three lenses, what I'm saying is they coexist in our society, and the diversity and the integrity lens are probably the reason why we have such strong culture wars, because they're the ones kind of aiming at each other around norms regarding sex and gender. But I like to identify them when I minister to families, when I counsel with families, to help people stop speaking past one another. Sometimes when I sit down with a family, or a church, I guess for that matter, if I consult with a board or something like that, I run into what happens when I talk to someone who doesn't speak English and I don't speak their language. What happens is I shout in English louder. And did you ever do this? And it just, like, I don't take the time to learn their language. They don't speak English. I'm shouting in English louder. It's like that in this cultural discourse. It's like the one group of integrity is shouting integrity, integrity, integrity to the diversity folks who are shouting back, celebrate, celebrate, celebrate. And neither one of them wants to take the time to understand why a rational person with a big heart might come to a conclusion that's so different than them. Why would that happen? How do we coexist in such a diverse and pluralistic culture? So I talk about it to avoid speaking past one another. I try to do it to facilitate what psychologists call cognitive complexity. Just like, can you see through the eyes of the other? Like that's a really good thing to learn to do. You don't have to agree with them to see through their eyes. How do they see this? And it's really important in families. How do I talk to my teenager, my loved one, who sees through a different lens than I do? And how do I invite my loved one to see through the eyes that I see through this with? And that's really tough. Or spouses can see through these things differently. I don't know how many of you have watched the reality show, I Am Jazz. But years ago, Barbara Walters has been interviewing Jazz every few years. And when Jazz was like 11, Jazz is one of the youngest cases of a biological male raised as female in the U.S. and now has a reality show. Jazz is a teenager now and in high school. And so anyway, years ago, Barbara Walters was interviewing Jazz and the older sister and two twin brothers, and ask them, hey, how do you explain Jazz to your friends? And the older sister says, well, I mean, I'd say that it's a disorder and it's not something that she chose. And Barbara Walters, she's been at this a while and she knows what just happened. And she looked at Jazz and says, Jazz, what's it like for you to hear your sister talk about you that way? And Jazz says, well, I don't like that word, disorder, because I think to be transgender is to be special or unique, because that's who I am. Now, if you've seen this show, you know these folks, they all love each other, okay? But you could imagine in ministry meeting with a mom or a dad, parents who operate more out of an integrity lens, and you could have a sibling who operates more out of that disability lens, because that's what she was doing and talking to her friends. It's a disorder. It's not something Jazz chose. Don't hate Jazz for this, right? And Jazz hears that and says, I can't imagine a future where I could flourish if I thought of myself in those terms as disordered. So I think of myself as special or unique because that's an identity where I could thrive. Okay, and they can coexist in the same family and love one another. So I use these lenses sometimes just to facilitate a better conversation. And then to begin to think to myself and maybe with the people that meet with me, is there a way to pull together from each of these lenses the best that each one offers? You know, for example, I think the theology of the integrity lens, the exegesis there, I think their work is probably the best. I think it is the strongest. But I think they lack significantly on compassion and empathy. And I love when I see that come forward in the disability lens. But I also recognize that disability is not a sense of identity or community that people would resonate with. And as much as I disagree with many aspects of the diversity lens, I do realize that I have to tip my hat to them on this one point. They speak into identity and they speak into community in ways that are very compelling to people navigating this terrain. And I think the church has failed to appreciate how much of a draw that would be to people who are gay or trans, how to figure that sense of identity and community out has been very compelling. So that might be helpful to you as you think about that. When I think about sexual identity and engaging the changing culture, I often teach about a three-tier distinction between attraction and orientation and identity. This has also been useful to a number of people I've ministered to. Some are drawn to language that's more descriptive to just describe what they feel, the attractions they have. Others describe their orientation. Others are more interested in using gay as an adjective to describe themselves, maybe not an identity per se. And others, they disagree with me and they celebrate a gay identity and culture and community in ways that would be different than my views on that. And as I counsel people, I just give them this distinction. It's almost like you're deconstructing what's become a gay identity and you're giving them the parts of it and you're saying, how is this for you to think about it in its parts? And what of these parts resonate for you? How do you find it best to sort of think about yourself without me having an agenda for how they talk about themselves, just giving them space, a kind of clinical hospitality in the room to think through and pray about these different things. That's been helpful to a lot of people. And the other thing that we've been doing is studying how people come to think of themselves as gay as central to their sense of personhood. I used to think people just kind of woke up and they knew that they were gay. And as I was looking at mainstream gay researchers, they were studying it as a developmental process. And so what we were doing was they were studying these milestones in the formation of a gay identity. And gay here I'm using as an umbrella for gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer. But it was things like first awareness of my attractions, first behavior, first time I thought in terms of what does this mean, my attributions. When did I label myself or use a label? When did I share this with other people? And when did I think about an ongoing same-sex relationship? So it was funny how we started to do research with Christians about these same milestones. And I started to think about it in therapy at the same time as like a metaphor. These are folks who are hiking difficult terrain. Think Bear Grylls, right? Like hiking difficult terrain. And the terrain is like hard to get sure footing on. And you're walking this out in your life as you navigate your same-sex sexuality, which you didn't choose, and you're trying to make sense of it. And so you kind of put in here the different milestones that you might come across. This is the book that'll be out next month. It's the first 2 years of a study we've been doing of Christians at Christian colleges around the country who are navigating sexual identity. So we call them sexual minorities. Sexual minorities is shorthand for people who experience same-sex attraction independent of behavior and independent of use of an identity label. And so it's really helpful with Christian samples because many Christians don't engage in same-sex behavior and many Christians don't adopt gay as an identity label. So you have to have a name for them. What are they? And so in psychology, we call them sexual minorities. I'm not using it as a like a civil rights argument. I get that email every now and then. So if you're writing that email, I'll just ask you to, you don't have to do that. I got it. Don't engage. But it's just shorthand for people who experience same-sex attraction independent of attraction, identity, or behavior. And I realize there's some irony in taking that long to explain shorthand right now, but that's what that is. It'll pay off if I use the word even one more time. So in ministry and counseling, or as a family, you sort of think that your loved one is navigating, first being aware of their attractions. And attributions is like, what do I make of it? For some people, it's like, I was born this way, or this means this about me. God gave me these attractions and is saying, enjoy them. I mean, that's one attribution, right? Others would say, no, it's like a thorn in my flesh. It's like something like what Paul asked God. He asked him, would you remove this? And God said, no, my grace is sufficient for you. I'll be present in your life, but I'm not going to remove this from you. I can be glorified in this, that kind of a quality to it. Well, those are two very different attributions. And so what I tend to explore are how attributions function in a person's life and how you can minister, how you can respond to that person and help expand and join them on an attributional search for identity. How do I make sense of this in my life? How do I connect this, if I'm a Christian, to transcendent purposes? What does God want for me in this? Who can I trust with what I'm going through is the question of disclosure. I mean, that's a legit question. Who can I trust with this? I think it's better to tell people about it than to keep this boxed up. It's not healthy to feel like you kind of keep it hidden. It's very shame-inducing to have an experience in your life that you feel you can't tell anybody about. Because what it ends up suggesting is that you're afraid that people would reject you if they knew this about you. And what it often signals is you've rejected yourself because you feel that somehow you're responsible for this. And can I tell you that is a very understandable but unhealthy way to do life? That we're at our best when we can talk with people about the things that we're feeling and challenged with, the things that we're navigating. Should I engage in sexual behavior or not? My recommendation is it's always better to delay sexual behavior so that the older and more mature you are, you can bring that into that decision making. Should I label myself gay privately, publicly? How should I be known by other people? And that's a complicated area to think through. Language. I don't make a lot out of language, but I understand that for some people, it's really something that they grapple with. What about ongoing same-sex relationships? The underlying question that people are asking is this: how will my needs for intimacy be met? Even if I follow church teaching in this area and if I refrain from sexual behavior, I still have needs for intimacy. How will those be met? Those are legitimate questions for parents to understand that their loved ones are grappling with, for people in ministry and counseling to understand that the people they serve are asking really good questions. That's the place of ministry, through these milestones. So one image I often give people is it's almost like there's a storm cloud between a conflict of their sexual and religious identity and their sense of who am I in all of this. And what I've suggested is the gay community has answers to those questions. The diversity lens, that lens that celebrates being gay or celebrates same-sex sexuality, is answering two of the most fundamental questions young people ask today. Who am I, and of what community am I a part? Questions of identity and questions of community. Do you know the gay community is called the family for a reason? They try to be family to one another to show greater hospitality to a young person navigating same-sex sexuality. It has become, for many young people, a place of friendship and belonging. And it provides role models for young people. I remember asking someone who was in ministry to college-age students, I said to her, how do people find models for their lives? Because everybody kind of looks in college or high school, they want to see, is there somebody like 10 years older than me who's sort of doing life the way I'd like to do life? And heterosexual teens and college-age students have a lot of those models in their life. But young people navigating same-sex sexuality don't. And so she told me, you know what they do to find models? They go to YouTube channels. And they just watch gay people like doing life together. They might be dating or whatever. They go out and they go to work, they come home, they make dinner for each other, they're funny, they're super engaging. They're they're not Christians. They're not living sort of a life of sort of faith and sexual identity, but young people are so desperate to have a sense of future that they'll watch anybody who's gay, who's like living a life that seems normal to them. Could I have that for me? And then they've got to sort of piece together what that would mean in terms of my faith. Like, how would I do that and be a Christian? It's hard for them. But they're looking for those role models, and they need them. So in my work, I talked about the way in which the gay community and the broader culture has given young people a script for making sense of their sexuality, that their attractions signal a naturally occurring distinction among types of people. They signal who the person really is, and they're sort of at the core of their sense of identity. And their behavior is not something anyone should scrutinize. It's just an expression of self and personhood that they should delight in. And now you can talk about the self-actualization of your sexual identity. I guess what I'm saying to you is I think the church has failed to appreciate how compelling this script would be to a young person. That if you're 14 and navigating same-sex sexuality, that's a very compelling script. I mean, forget about 14. If you're 24, 44, 54, that's very compelling. And I don't think the church has really offered a different vision for identity and community, a different way of thinking about yourself that would be in any way equally compelling to this. And there may be even pieces of this that you might resonate with. I think it's challenging. It's not like I'm critical of all of the gay script. I think we would have to have sort of a nuanced discussion of what of this fits with a Christian understanding and what of this would we sort of critique? How would we engage it? But of course, our culture doesn't engage it. Our culture just kind of lives this out as a cultural expectation for making sense of your same-sex sexuality. That script is only made more appealing in contrast to what people experience in their local church community. You see, in their local church community, they usually hear pretty negative messages about people navigating same-sex sexuality or gender identity. They usually hear things like, gays are an abomination, or gays are ruining marriage, or gays are ruining this country. And it creates that us versus them dynamic in which a 14-year-old can't really parse out doctrine from social cultural warfare. And in their mind, if you create an us versus them, and this 14-year-old is experiencing same-sex sexuality, they conclude pretty quickly that they must be a them by virtue of how we're talking about it. And is it any wonder that they kind of go underground with their sexuality and they don't tell anybody about it until often when they go to college? That's what we find in our studies. A lot of times, and sometimes they've told people, like a youth minister or someone else. I remember one interview, the person said to them, "Don't tell anybody else in our church." So they didn't. This one interview was with someone, it was like 40 years later, and they'd said they haven't told anyone for 40 years because of what the person told them at that one moment of disclosure. How painful would that be? Now, I would say today, more 14 and 15-year-olds are likely to tell people than to just keep it under wraps. But when they do tell people, they tend to tell people with a great sense of certainty. This is who I am. It's almost like they come home at Thanksgiving, they plant a sexual identity label flag right on top of their turkey at Thanksgiving and said, "This is who I am, and you'll have to deal with that." And I think it's better, if you're a parent here, to see that almost as an act of resilience rather than an act of defiance. I think for many young people, they sit with this, they sit with this, they sit with this. The average age of going through puberty is about 10 and a half for a biological female, about 11 and a half for a biological male. So their first sort of awareness of their sexuality occurs shortly after that. And they might not disclose for the next 4 years. And so sometimes when they do come out, they can come out with such act of certainty, it's almost resilience to tell people this is who I am if I'm going to risk telling you about this. And then sort of we react to that, and it kind of spirals from there. Would it be more helpful if they just described what they felt and kind of brought you in? Sure, but they're a teenager and they're doing this as best they can. And so ours is the role of being the adult in the room and saying, okay, let's see how how we can be a resource to you, even if they're not asking right now to be a resource. But how can I love you well as you navigate these questions? Because I understand, you're not saying this to the teenager, but you're understanding how compelling that vision of identity and community would be. And it gives you a place to pray into their life and to recognize this is going to be challenging to navigate. Now, I have a lot of parents who stop by my office with a loved one, teenager. They usually try to drop them off and leave and say, I'll be back in an hour. And I say, Mom, why don't you park the car? Why don't you come on in? We're not dropping anybody off here. And I say to parents, take the long view. Your loved one will be navigating this terrain for many years to come. And they need you. In fact, in our studies of college students, they're navigating this all the way through college. But the problem with studying college students is everything developmental resolves while they're still in the college, because that's when you've got them. But if you study people in the community, we did a study of people navigating same-sex sexuality and faith one time in the community. And the average age that person, the Christian, who disidentified with the gay community and formed their identity in other aspects of their personhood, like an identity in Christ or something like that, the average age for them to figure that out in their life was 26. And the group of people who embraced a gay identity and embraced a sort of affirming gay position as a Christian and kind of went down that direction, the average age for them to figure that out was 26. The average age of the conservative Christian who disidentified with the gay community and the organizations that would support a gay identity, the average age for them to figure this out was 34. So when a parent drops off a teen and says, could you work that out with my loved one? I do want to tell them, take the long view. Your loved one is navigating some really difficult terrain. And parents, the way I think of parents is their base camp. If you're hiking, you need a place to be able to come back to be refreshed as a resource to you as you hike. The most important relationship they have is with their parents. It's the best predictor of their well-being over time, is the quality of that relationship. On gender identity, I wanted to say that there is something like a gay script for transgender people. That gender incongruence signals a distinction among types of people. We can now talk about transgender, cisgender, non-binary types of people. That gender incongruence signals who a person really is, and the variations that they experience and express is at the core of who they are as a person. And yes, they can adopt a cross-gender or other gender identity. It's confirmation and expression of that reality of you, who you really are. And you can talk about the self-actualization of your gender identity. And I think we have a long way to go to understand this experience. It's not that it's new, but it's a relatively recent phenomenon to be so central to our cultural discourse about norms regarding sex and gender. And I think in many ways, I was afraid that the church would have sort of a knee-jerk reaction to it and just see it as one more erosion of norms that you'd have to sort of lament and fight against. I think sometimes when we do that, we lose the people who are actually navigating gender identity concerns. We make something so political that we forget that there's real people who are walking this out and trying to do it in faith and trying to do it before God and asking really good questions as they do it. So I'd love for us to continue an ongoing discussion of just the complexities of that. We don't know what causes these gender identity concerns that people have. We don't know how to resolve it. We don't have good answers. We don't have good long-term research findings on the best ways to work this out. I'd love for the church to respond to this with more humility about what we know and what we don't know, to not be afraid of science. I know from hanging out in those communities, scientists can sometimes overstate what they know and act like the resolutions are a foregone conclusion and everybody should think this way. Friends, there's a lot we don't understand about causal pathways and theories of etiology and the best way to respond. So I invite them too, when I'm speaking to them, to have more humility when we talk to families. But when I talk with you, I would urge us as a church to have greater humility. It's also been helpful to me to distinguish 3 levels of identity. This might be useful to you as well. There are people who are ideologues, And their approach to this is that of sheer advocacy. They are leading the cultural wars in the areas of sexuality and gender. They are following Foucault and Judith Butler and others' philosophies that deconstruct norms regarding sex and gender. And some of us in the church are going to be called to respond to that. Our training and our background in theology and philosophy equips us to respond to ideology with a very rigorous scholarship that challenges it from a Christian theistic worldview. But that's not most people you're going to meet. There's a whole lot of people you're going to meet whose identity is not political, it's public. They're your neighbors. They're your coworkers. They're the people you're running into who dropped off your pizza. These are the folks whose public identity is that they're trans. And they're trying to figure this out too, or they have figured it out. All they want is to live a life. And you can be a Christian witness to them in how you relate to them, how you are a neighbor to them, a coworker to them, how you relate to them on the day-to-day. And then there's a group of people for whom this is their personal identity. They are actively navigating gender identity or sexual identity conflicts in their life. And they're going to come to counseling with someone like me, or they're going to come to ministry at North Star, and they're going to be asking for help navigating this terrain. They're sincerely struggling with this. They're not an assertive advocate. They're sincerely struggling with this. One of my greatest fears is that people in the church will think there's one type of person out there and I respond to each of them the same way. Friends, if we respond to our neighbors like they're political advocates, assertive advocates, we will lose our Christian witness. If we counsel people in ministry as though they're assertive advocates who are ideologues, we will fail to minister to them effectively. In other words, each of you is called to something along this triangle here, this pyramid. We are all called to that middle place, to be a good Christian witness to people in our community that we run into who are navigating these issues or have found a resolution in their life. Be a witness to them. Be Christ to them. Some of us are called to minister to those people navigating that space. Let's equip ourselves to do that with compassion and integrity. And then some of us are going to be called to respond to ideology. A very sophisticated philosophical and theological engagement from a Christian worldview. What are you called to do? Who are you called to respond to? If you're called to do ministry, let me say this to you. Most of ministry happens underneath the surface. With icebergs, a very small percentage of an iceberg is above the surface. What's above the surface on these issues is gender atypicality and sexual identity labels. People calling themselves gay or queer, or people cross-dressing or expressing themselves in a different gender expression. People respond to what's above the surface and think they're doing ministry. People tell people, don't call yourself gay, don't call yourself queer, don't call yourself that. Okay, all right, okay. Have we now exhausted ministry? I mean, that's just, ministry is beneath the surface. Don't dress that way, don't do that, don't express yourself that way. Okay, all right, okay. Have you ministered to the person yet? Ministry occurs beneath the surface. What's beneath the surface for folks navigating these issues? I organize them into 5 fundamental questions. That does not exhaust this for anybody. But obviously people are asking, who am I in light of this? That was kind of where I began with identity development, whether it's sexual identity or gender identity. Who am I in light of my gender identity questions? Who am I in light of my same-sex sexuality? Who am I? What is my relationship with God like? What does God think about me? Why would God create a world where I would have these impulses or have this experience, and then he would sort of lay out boundaries around that? What does that mean for me? Can I have a relationship with God? Does the fact that I'm navigating gender identity preclude me from a life in Christ? Do my questions about sexuality preclude me from a saving relationship with Christ? Or what about, most people I've interviewed have pretty good experiences actually with God. Where they struggle is the church, the actual people who represent God on earth. What's my relationship like with the church? Will the fact that I ask these questions mean that I'm not welcome in youth group? Will the fact that I am struggling with this mean I'm not able to be in leadership on the worship team? Will the fact that this is a part of my life mean that you won't trust me around your children in children's ministry? What about my relationship with others, particularly parents? I have parents who come to me sometimes and say, I don't even know our daughter anymore after she came out to us. And I'll take a few minutes with them and I'll grab a sheet of paper and I'll put a line down the middle and I'll ask them to describe their daughter to me. And they'll say, our she's really smart. She's always been really athletic. She's one of the most compassionate people you'll ever meet. And she's always loved Jesus. And she's artistic. And she's got this great knack for just making people feel at ease. And then over here on this line, I'll put her same-sex sexuality or her gender identity questions. And I'll say to them, your daughter didn't stop being all these things because now you know about her sexual identity questions, or now you know about the gender identity concerns that she told you about. In fact, I might even make the argument, if you'll let me, you may know more about your daughter now because she told you this. You might think of it more as an invitation to intimacy, because she was all these things and continues to be those things. And she was navigating these questions around sexuality or gender identity, but you didn't know it. And so now she brought you in. So now you know something you didn't know. Let's reframe this, Mom and Dad, as an invitation to intimacy. And no, maybe she didn't do it in the best way. Maybe she threw out some pictures on IG and that's how you learned about it. And maybe that's not the best way to do this, but okay. Here's where we are. Maybe we know her better today. The last area is future story. We have to respond as a faith community to the question, will it get better? Where am I going with all this? What's going to happen to me in 5 or 10 years? Can you cast a vision for me where I could have a future story where I could thrive? Why was the It Gets Better campaign so compelling to so many young people? Because they're asking that question. It would have been a great campaign for the church to do. In what ways does it get better from a faith perspective? I think the fact that we don't do campaigns like that is because we don't know the answer to it. We really struggle with whether we can cast a positive vision. Christian communities are often either silent or they send the message of no in this area. You have to answer the question, what is the positive vision for a Christian to live into? Realize that the gay community offers a compelling yes that meets needs for intimacy and belonging that the church needs to respond to. One person in a study we did of college counseling students, sexual minorities, there, shorthand. It was really hard for me to tell other people with the same religious beliefs about my experiences with same-sex attraction, because I already knew what they believed about it, that it's immoral, and I thought they'd think I'd chosen to be attracted to the same sex. This was a really conservative student who said, I'm not even going to tell people about this, because the people I know, the people I run with, would assume I chose it. So I'm not even going to tell them. Another person said, the church I went to when I started changing built up a lot of emotions and led me to believe there was a simple change, create a lot of resentment and bitterness towards the church. I want to read a passage from Scripture that I don't normally associate with this topic. You know, you're probably familiar with the 7 or so passages that gets quoted so much in like Romans and Leviticus and things like that. I really don't tend to focus on those passages, not that they're not relevant. I tend to think of the 4 acts of the biblical drama of creation, fall, redemption, glorification as a more coherent and compelling thing to hang your discussion of individual verses on. But anyway, there's this passage from John 9 that reads, as he went along, Jesus saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned that this man or his parents that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so the works of God might be displayed in him. The King James Version says the works of God can be made manifest in him. Now, the only reason I even reference this is because this was referenced by C.S. Lewis years ago. He was received a letter from a young couple who had recently given their lives to Christ. And you know what happened to this young couple? They were asked to lead a Bible study for other people who had recently given their lives to Christ. Can you imagine? You're a recent convert and you're asked to lead a Bible study for other people who are now Christians? Anyway, so they have something like 2 or 3 gay people in their small group. And so they do what a lot of people do today without email. They wrote to C.S. Lewis and they said, what are your thoughts about this? They've asked us, what does a life in Christ mean for someone who's homosexual, is the language they used back then. And so they wrote to him and said, what are your thoughts about it? We've got thoughts about it. They shared their thoughts about it. What are your thoughts about it? And so C.S. Lewis wrote them back. It's the only time we have documented response from C.S. Lewis on this topic. Here's part of what he said. This is only an interim report, which is what people say when they're not sure what they're saying. They might get back to you with more details. I know what he's doing here. I got you. I see what you did there. Okay. First, to map out the boundaries within which all discussion must go on, sort of lay a framework. I take it for certain, he's going to use language here that's a little, probably a little off for how people talk about this today, but I take it for certain that the physical satisfaction of homosexual desires is sin. And this leaves the homosexual no worse off than any normal person who is, for whatever reason, prevented from marrying. Our speculations on the cause of the abnormality are not what matters, and we must be content with ignorance. The disciples were not told why, in terms of efficient cause, the man was born blind in John 9. So there's that reference to the passage I read. Only the final cause, that the works of God should be made manifest in him. This suggests that in homosexuality, as in every other tribulation, those works can be made manifest. That is, that every disability conceals a vocation, if only we can find it. Do you know what happened with the disciples? This was very common with the Jews of the day, as Jesus was teaching as a rabbi, was that people assumed that if people had a condition, that they themselves sinned or their parents sinned. What I find with homosexuality or gay and lesbian issues and gender identity is the very same dynamic. Whose sin that this person struggles with gender dysphoria or same-sex sexuality? Did this person sin or did their parents sin? I hear this all the time. We're not that far removed from the disciples who asked Jesus this very question. And Jesus said, neither. This isn't about sin as the causal pathway for this condition. That somebody's specific moral failure led to this phenomenon of gender or sexual identity questions in their life. These things are a part of people's lives in the big picture of things so God can be glorified. The great question in ministry is, how do we carve a path between what we experience and how God is glorified? How do we carve a path between the reality of their same-sex sexuality or gender identity conflicts? How do we carve a path between that and a sense of purpose and meaning and vocation where God could actually be glorified? How do we connect this to transcendent reality? That was the question Lewis asked, and that is the question we're asking today. When I first started my career, I spent 10 years of part of my career doing a 7-year longitudinal study about whether people changed orientation through involvement in Christian ministries. And let me tell you this, nobody liked this study. I mean, nobody liked this study. Maybe my mom liked this study, but she was proud of me. I'm not even sure how many people read this. There was a 400-page book of nothing but research. I mean, talk about beach reading. It was rough. But anyway, there's sort of 2 groups of people in the culture wars on this book. There were cynical pessimists who would say nobody's ever experienced any change. Anybody who says so is lying to you. And they didn't like our study because we showed that there was some movement, some shifts along a continuum on average for people. And then so I call these the cynical pessimists. And then over here were the arrogant optimists. These were the people who would say anybody who tries hard enough or has enough faith can expect a 180-degree change from gay to straight. And we didn't show that either. The truth was somewhere in between. People were making some meaningful shifts along a continuum, but we don't know why. It wasn't a process study of the process of movement for people. It could have been just natural fluidity for people. I don't know. But it wasn't dramatic. And even people who did say it was a stronger sense of change, they struggled with same-sex attraction from time to time, and our critics said, bah, that's not change. Okay, I'm just telling you the data. I'm just telling you what we found. Other people made behavioral changes and changes in identity, how they thought about themselves and whether they engaged in sexual behavior. And people said, that's not change. Okay, it's not maybe changing the underlying attractions, but it was meaningful change to these people. They were trying to live according to a traditional Christian sexual ethic, and by refraining from behavior, they were able to do that. And they said that they were able to do that because the strength and intensity of their attractions, for some of them, diminished a little bit in their intensity, and they were able to live a chaste life, whereas before it was harder for them to do that. So it was a complicated study. Nobody liked it. I would say that some of the changes were in behavior. These were more readily available and shifts, some in attraction, but a lot of it was in identity and how a person thought about themselves and their sexuality. Like this person said, I think it's been very successful and that it made my walk with Christ closer. Someone else said, I'd say that is reminding me of God's intimate care and reminding me of his care for me, that he's gentle and he'll walk with me. I guess that's basically saying it's okay to struggle. Another person said, I would say the biggest thing on my mind right now is self-acceptance. It's like dealing with all of this self-hate I never knew I had. So for me, the focus has been away from orientation that measures a person's worth against their heterosexual potential. I really try to help people lean into Christ-likeness rather than heterosexuality. Not to discourage people from that if that's their experience. I know people who have that testimony. But I know many people who are no more Christ-like by virtue of their heterosexuality. Maybe you do as well. I aim for Christ-likeness with people, fostering that walk and their spiritual maturity that will inform the decisions they make about identity and behavior. I don't tend to minister out of rigid categories and labels. I tend to be more descriptive and work with people where they are. You'll hear me use language like helping people navigate terrain. I use that a lot. And help them anchor their identity in the person and work of Jesus Christ. When I go back to this image, here's what I'm going to close with. You have broadly two communities. One that's saying yes to identity, yes to community, yes to intimacy, yes to status. And for many young people today, they hear a resounding no. A no to identity, a no to community, a no to intimacy, a no to status. Friends, our great challenge, our great call is to create a yes that eclipses both the yes from the mainstream LGBTQ community and the no that's been heard from the Christian community. We need a larger, more meaningful yes that eclipses both the yes and the no that people are encountering today. And you and I, we have an opportunity to develop that larger, more meaningful yes and to minister out of it to the glory of God. Thank you.